My name is Helen Cartwright, and I never imagined my marriage would turn into a chess game played in my own kitchen with my life as the prize. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. It was a Thursday evening in late September when Arthur came home with a bag of groceries clutched awkwardly in his hands. That alone was unusual. The man hadn't stepped into a supermarket in the 27 years we'd been married, unless it was to follow me around complaining about the price of tomatoes. But this time, there he was standing in the doorway, like some sitcom husband caught in the wrong house. A paper bag in one arm, a bunch of parsley sticking out the top. "I thought I'd make us dinner tonight," he said, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. I blinked at him. "You, yes me? Why think I'm incapable of boiling water?" I laughed maybe too quickly and shook my head. "Arthur, you've literally burned toast before." He grinned, but it had a strange tightness to it. "Well, I'm a fast learner. Besides, you've been looking tired lately. I thought I'd take some weight off your shoulders." It was sweet, in theory. But Arthur was not a man of sudden romantic gestures. His kindnesses were predictable: a card on our anniversary flowers on my birthday, maybe a refill of my coffee, when he remembered. But cooking, that was uncharted territory. Still, I let him shoo me out of my own kitchen. He rolled up his sleeves and began unpacking the groceries: chicken breasts, fresh herbs, olive oil, garlic bulbs. He even had a little jar of something I didn't recognize, its label worn away. "Secret ingredient," he said when I asked. "Can't tell you. Chef's rules." I sat in the living room pretending to read while the sound of chopping and the smell of sizzling garlic filled the house. For a moment it felt nice. Strange, but nice. When he brought the plate to me, golden chicken in a rich sauce, potatoes roasted just right, I couldn't help but smile. "This looks amazing," I said. Arthur leaned on the back of the chair watching me take the first bite. It was delicious. Different from how I cooked, heavier on the seasoning, a slight bitter edge I couldn't quite place, but still good. "See, not bad for a first-timer, huh?" I nodded. "Not bad at all." He watched me eat the whole plate, his expression unreadable. When I offered him a bite, he waved it off. "Already had some while cooking." That night, though, I woke with a dull ache in my stomach. It wasn't sharp, just uncomfortable, the kind of ache you'd blame on eating too much or trying a new spice. I dismissed it, took an antacid, and went back to sleep. The next evening, Arthur announced he was cooking again. "You sure?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He chuckled. "Don't look so shocked. You deserve a little pampering." And so it began. The chopping, the sizzling, the careful plating. Each meal was different: creamy soups, baked fish, pasta with homemade sauce, but each had that faintly bitter aftertaste, like the ghost of a flavor that didn't belong. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, what kind of wife suspects her husband of, what exactly? Bad seasoning. Yet something about the way he hovered when I took the first bite, the way he seemed almost too invested in my reaction, it left a cold thread of unease winding through my ribs. On the third night, as I scraped the last of a mushroom risotto from my plate, I noticed Arthur hadn't eaten much of his. "Not hungry?" I asked. "Already full," he said. "You know me, I like tasting as I go." That night, the ache in my stomach returned. This time, it was accompanied by a faint dizziness, a fuzziness at the edge of my vision. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the thought forming in the back of my mind. A thought so ugly, so absurd that I almost laughed it away. Almost. Looking back now, that first meal was the opening move. The parsley, the secret ingredient, the smile that didn't quite touch his eyes, they were all pieces placed on the board. And I, foolishly touched by the novelty of his attention, didn't yet see the game for what it was. But I would. Oh, I would. Arthur's new hobby didn't fade after a few days as I'd expected. If anything, it intensified. Every evening, he came home with another bag of groceries, always with a vague explanation about trying something new. At first, I thought it was a midlife crisis in slow motion. Some men bought sports cars. Arthur apparently bought time and saffron. But what unsettled me was his precision. He was no longer fumbling with measuring cups or peering at recipe cards. He moved around the kitchen with the ease of someone who had done this for years, which made no sense, because for nearly 3 decades, I had been the one cooking every meal. On the fifth night, he made beef bourguignon. The smell was intoxicating, rich, savory, the kind that made you think of old French bistros. "Smells incredible," I said, leaning against the doorway. He smiled without looking up from the pot. "Good. I want it to be perfect." When we sat down, he placed the bowl in front of me like an offering. The broth was dark, almost black, with a sheen of oil glistening on the surface. I took a bite. Tender beef, soft carrots, earthy mushrooms, and then that aftertaste again, faint but lingering, coating the back of my tongue. "What's in this?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just the usual suspects. Red wine herbs stock." His tone was light, but his eyes flicked away too quickly. I let it go, though my stomach twisted with something other than hunger. The next morning, I woke up with a dull headache and a metallic tang in my mouth. It wasn't unbearable, just strange. As I sipped my coffee, I replayed the past week in my mind. The aftertaste, the headaches, the occasional waves of nausea. Could it just be coincidence? Maybe I was coming down with something. Maybe my body was just adjusting to heavier food. But the thought didn't settle. It hovered like a shadow you can't quite see, but feel all the same. That weekend, Arthur upped his game. "Thought I'd try seafood tonight," he announced, holding up a bag of fresh clams and mussels. "You hate seafood," I reminded him. He shrugged. "You love it. That's all that matters." It sounded sweet, but the longer I looked at him, the more it felt rehearsed, like a line in a play. The clam chowder he made was creamy and fragrant, dotted with bacon and parsley. I took one spoonful and paused. There it was again, that strange bitter note, like the echo of something burned, except nothing was burned. Arthur watched me closely. "Good." I forced a smile. "Delicious." That night, the ache in my stomach was sharper. I lay curled under the blankets, listening to the sound of Arthur brushing his teeth in the bathroom. When he climbed into bed, he put a hand on my back. "You okay?" "Just a little indigestion," I murmured. He hummed sympathetically. "Must be stress. You've been working a lot." The thing was, I hadn't. My hours at the bookstore were the same as always. If anything, life had been quieter lately. The following week, he made chicken cacciatore. I'd barely finished half the plate when a wave of dizziness swept over me, so sudden I gripped the edge of the table. Arthur was at my side instantly, hand on my shoulder. "Whoa, sit still. You're pale." I managed a weak smile. Just stood up too fast. He guided me to the couch, brought me water, and hovered like an attentive nurse. But in the back of my mind, a thought whispered, one I didn't want to hear, but couldn't silence. He was always right there when the symptoms hit. Always ready with water. Always watching. The turning point came on a Wednesday night. Arthur had made pasta with a creamy spinach sauce. Halfway through the meal, he excused himself to grab the parmesan. I watched him walk into the kitchen. He reached into a high cabinet, one I rarely touched, and pulled down a small jar. His back was to me, but I saw the movement of his hand dipping something into the jar, then sprinkling it over the pot on the stove. When he returned, the parmesan was in his other hand. I stared at the food in front of me. My fork hovered. Arthur smiled. "Go on before it gets cold." I took a small bite, but my stomach knotted instantly, not from the food, but from the knowledge that something about this was wrong. That night, the aftertaste felt stronger. My tongue tingled faintly, and my head buzzed as though I'd had too much wine, though I'd had none. As I lay in the dark, Arthur's breathing steady beside me, my mind replayed every moment of the past 2 weeks. The shopping trips, the secret ingredient, the way he watched me eat like he was waiting for a result. And for the first time, I allowed the thought to fully form. What if Arthur wasn't cooking for love? What if he was cooking for something else entirely? Once the idea took root, it wouldn't leave me. It was like tasting bitterness in a cup of tea, and then realizing it had been there every morning for weeks. I didn't tell Arthur, of course. I couldn't. If I was wrong, I'd look paranoid. If I was right, I needed to be sure before I said anything. The next day, I started keeping track. I dug out an old spiral notebook from the desk and tucked it into the back of the kitchen pantry behind the flour canister where Arthur never looked. Each time he cooked, I jotted down the meal, the ingredients I saw, and how I felt afterward. Chicken with herb sauce, mild stomach ache, metallic aftertaste. Beef bourguignon, headache, dizziness. Clam chowder, sharper stomach pain, tingling tongue. It didn't take long for the pattern to emerge. The symptoms always appeared after his meals. On the nights I cooked or we ordered takeout, I felt fine. I also noticed something else. Arthur never ate more than a few bites of what he made. He'd claim he'd filled up while cooking or wasn't that hungry, then pour himself a drink and watch me finish my plate. One evening, I decided to test him. He made a roasted vegetable soup fragrant with rosemary and garlic. When he set it down, I smiled and said, "You first." Arthur laughed. "Ladies first." I held his gaze. "Come on, I want to see if it's as good as you think." He hesitated just a beat too long before taking a small spoonful, making a show of savoring it. But he didn't take another bite. The more I watched, the stranger things seemed. Sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, he'd adjust his glasses and glance at his watch, while I ate as if he were timing something. And then, there were the little jars. Not just the one with the worn label, but others I didn't recognize, tucked in the back of the spice rack. They weren't part of my kitchen inventory, and their contents didn't look like anything I'd ever used. One held a fine white powder, another, a pale green dust. He never left them out for long. By the third week, the symptoms had escalated. After a plate of pasta with creamy pesto, I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to grip the counter to steady myself. My vision blurred around the edges and a cold sweat broke across my neck. Arthur appeared beside me almost instantly. "Sit down," he urged, guiding me to a chair. His hands were gentle, his voice calm, almost rehearsed. I mumbled something about a stomach bug. He nodded sympathetically. "See, this is why I've been cooking for you. You need to rest." Rest. Yes. That was one word for it. The breaking point came one night when Arthur made a hearty stew. Halfway through eating, my lips began to tingle faintly at first, then enough for me to notice. I set my spoon down. Arthur glanced at it. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I said quickly. "Just full." He frowned. "You barely touched it." "I had a late lunch." He studied me for a moment, then smiled, that same smile that never quite reached his eyes, and gathered the bowls. That night, I flushed the rest of the stew down the sink after he went to bed. From then on, I got creative. If he made dinner, I'd pretend to take a second helping but would scrape most of the food into a container when he wasn't looking. I started keeping those containers in the garage freezer hidden behind an old ice cream maker. And when I stopped eating his food, something miraculous happened. My symptoms began to fade. That was when fear turned into certainty. It wasn't bad cooking. It wasn't coincidence. Arthur was putting something in my meals. The question now was, why? And deep down, I already knew the answer wouldn't be simple or safe. It happened on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of morning where the world felt almost too normal. Arthur had left early, claiming he needed to run errands, though when I asked what kind, he just said, "You'll see tonight." I took advantage of the empty house to clean. There's a strange freedom in tidying when no one else is around. You can move through spaces without small talk or sidelong glances, touch what you want, without anyone asking why. I started in the kitchen wiping counters and reorganizing the spice rack, though I avoided the unfamiliar jars Arthur had brought home. Then, for reasons I still can't explain, I wandered into his study. It was a small room at the back of the house, more for show than use. Arthur didn't work from home. The desk was tidy, the bookshelves lined with mostly unread biographies and coffee table books. I'd been in here countless times to dust, but today something caught my eye. The top drawer of the desk left just slightly ajar. Arthur was meticulous about his things. He never left drawers open. Curiosity won. I slid it open and found a plain black notebook, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. No label, no title, just a faint grease smudge on the cover, as if it had been handled often. I flipped it open, expecting to see bills, maybe notes on some DIY project. Instead, I saw neat, deliberate handwriting, Arthur's handwriting, filling page after page. But these weren't recipes. At the top of each page was a date, followed by the name of a dish he'd cooked. Below that were notes not about cooking techniques, but about me. Chicken with herb sauce, ate full portion, slight cough afterward, 35 minutes later. Clam chowder, complained of mild stomach pain, color in cheeks, faded 50 minutes. Beef bourguignon, dizzy, held table, recovered in 15 minutes. My breath caught. He'd been keeping records. And not just of symptoms. Some entries included my weight, my blood pressure readings, which I sometimes mentioned after doctor visits, even notes about my medications. One page stopped me, cold. Dosage increased slightly. No noticeable difference in reaction, may need to extend exposure for cumulative effect. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't about experimenting with recipes, or even some twisted idea of helping me eat better. This was deliberate, calculated. My hands shook as I turned another page. There was a section labeled Tolerances with bullet points listing quantities in grams and milligrams. Next to each was a note about whether the reaction was sufficient, mild, or too severe. I couldn't even process what substance he was referring to. The notebook didn't name it directly, just referenced powder or solution, but I didn't need the word to know the truth. I snapped the notebook shut, my pulse hammering in my ears. For a long moment, I just stood there, clutching it like a lifeline and a weapon all at once. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to take it straight to the police. But I knew I didn't have enough, not yet. A notebook could be explained away, twisted into something innocent if Arthur tried hard enough. No, I needed proof he couldn't argue with. Still, I couldn't leave it here. I took my phone from my pocket, flipping to the camera app. Page by page, I photographed everything: dates, dishes, notes, dosages. My fingers were clumsy, my breathing uneven, but I didn't stop until I'd captured the last page. Then I slid the notebook back into the drawer exactly as I'd found it, making sure the angle was the same, the gap just as small. When Arthur came home that afternoon, he was carrying another bag of groceries. "How was your morning?" he asked, setting them on the counter. "Quiet," I said, forcing a smile. He leaned against the counter, studying me. "Good. You need quiet." If he noticed my trembling hands, he didn't say. That night, he made a fragrant curry, its golden sauce glistening under the kitchen light. I stirred it with my spoon, nodding at his story about running into an old coworker, but I didn't take a single bite. When he excused himself to take a phone call in the other room, I tipped the curry into a container and replaced it with a portion of leftover stew from the fridge. By the time he returned, I was scraping the bowl clean. "Good?" he asked. "Very," I lied. That night in bed, I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment since the first surprise dinner. The parsley, the worn labeled jar, his careful notes. He wasn't just watching me eat, he was studying me, testing me. And that realization brought a new kind of fear. Because if Arthur had been planning this for weeks, maybe longer, then what else had he planned? What would he do if he suspected I knew? The next morning, I woke early and slipped into the kitchen before he was up. I took one of the small spice jars, the white powder, and tipped a little onto a piece of paper. Then I folded it and tucked it into a sealed envelope, hiding it in my handbag. I didn't know exactly where to take it yet, but I knew I'd need it. Just like I knew I'd need those photos of the notebook. Because whatever Arthur's endgame was, I wasn't going to be his quiet, trusting wife anymore. Not in this kitchen. Not in this marriage. And I think that's when something inside me shifted. The fear didn't disappear, it was still there, coiled tight in my chest, but it had a twin now: resolve. Arthur had chosen the kitchen as his battlefield. Fine. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd forgotten that I'd spent my whole life here. Every knife, every jar, every hiding spot. I knew them better than he ever would. And I was done playing the unsuspecting victim. It was strange how once suspicion had a name, I started seeing connections everywhere. Some were flimsy, the way Arthur's eyes lingered on my plate, the way his fingers brushed the rim of my glass when he brought me water. Others felt heavier, like the weight of a memory that's been hiding in plain sight. One of those memories came back to me the following Thursday, and it didn't come alone. I was shelving new arrivals at the bookstore when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Helen, is that you?" I turned and almost dropped the stack in my arms. It was Margaret Holloway, an old colleague from my teaching days. We'd lost touch after she moved out of state, but here she was standing in front of me, with the same kind eyes, a little grayer around the temples. We hugged, and I felt that warmth of an old connection sparking to life. "What brings you back here?" I asked. She explained that she'd retired early and had just moved back to be closer to her daughter. Then she tilted her head. "And you? Still married to Arthur?" I hesitated a moment too long. "Yes, still married." Her smile faltered just a little. "That's good." She quickly changed the subject, but I caught something in her tone, a flicker of caution. We ended up grabbing coffee after my shift, and the conversation flowed easily at first. We talked about old students, the ridiculous new standardized testing rules, the price of groceries. But when I asked if she'd ever run into Arthur over the years, her expression shifted. "I saw him once years ago," she said slowly. "Not here in Cedar Falls, near the lakes. I was visiting a friend and I ran into him at a little farmer's market." "That's odd," I said. "He never mentioned going there." Margaret gave a small, humorless laugh. "I didn't think it was my business to bring it up. But he wasn't alone." My stomach tightened. "Who was he with?" She stirred her coffee eyes on the swirl. "A woman. About our age. Pretty in a quiet way. They looked close. I assumed it was before your time, but now that I think about it..." She looked up at me. "It wasn't before your time, was it?" "No," I said quietly. "It wasn't." That might have been enough to set my pulse racing, but Margaret wasn't done. "Her name was Lydia," she said after a moment. I remembered because a few months later I heard from my friend in Cedar Falls that she'd died. Sudden illness. They said it was some kind of heart failure. Her voice was careful, but the implication landed hard. "She died?" I asked. Margaret nodded. "I didn't think much of it at the time. But now, well, I shouldn't even say this, Helen, but the way Arthur looked at her that day, and the way he was fussing over the groceries she'd bought, it just reminds me of the way you said he's been cooking for you lately." The room seemed to tilt slightly. My coffee had gone cold in my hands. I forced a smile I didn't feel. I'm sure it was nothing. But on the inside, my mind was spinning. Arthur. With another woman. Cooking for her. And she'd died of an illness that came on quickly. It wasn't proof. It was just a story from years ago. But paired with the notebook, the hidden jars, the way my own body had been reacting, it was enough to make my skin crawl. That night I lay in bed beside him, listening to the even rhythm of his breathing. I pictured Lydia, her face unknown to me, but her fate uncomfortably close. I wondered if she'd felt the same creeping unease, the same quiet dread when he set a plate in front of her. Had she tried to tell anyone? Had she even had the chance? The thought made my chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with illness. Over the next few days, I started watching him more closely, not just in the kitchen, but in every small interaction. When I said I wasn't hungry, there was always a flicker so quick you could miss it of something in his expression. Not disappointment, not concern. I realized it was irritation. One evening, I caught him standing in the doorway to the garage looking toward the old freezer where I'd been hiding uneaten portions of his food. My pulse leapt, but he just closed the door and walked away. The real blow came the following weekend. We were supposed to have dinner at a neighbor's house, but an hour before we were meant to leave, Arthur claimed he wasn't feeling well. "You go without me," he said. "I'll just whip something up for myself." I offered to stay, but he insisted. So I went and came home earlier than expected thanks to a sudden rainstorm. When I walked in, the kitchen smelled faintly of lemon and herbs. Arthur was at the sink rinsing a single plate. "Thought you weren't hungry?" I said. He looked over his shoulder, startled. "I wasn't. Just made tea." But the plate. The plate had a smear of sauce on it, pale yellow with green flecks, the kind of sauce he often made for fish. And next to the sink, tucked just behind the coffee maker, was the worn labeled jar. I didn't say anything. Not yet. Instead, I smiled, hung up my coat, and went upstairs. But inside, something in me solidified. Margaret's warning wasn't just a coincidence. Arthur had a pattern, a history, and I was standing in the middle of it. That night, I texted Margaret, "If I needed to quietly find out more about Lydia, could you help?" Her reply came within minutes. "Yes, whatever you need." And just like that, I wasn't alone anymore. The next week, while Arthur was at work, Margaret and I sat at my kitchen table with our laptops. She pulled up old newspaper archives from Cedar Falls. It took a while, but we found it: Lydia's obituary. It was short, almost too neat. She'd passed peacefully at home after a brief illness. No mention of family beyond beloved partner Arthur Bennett. My throat tightened. Bennett was Arthur's middle name, one he sometimes used for business dealings. We dug deeper, finding a few community newsletter blurbs about Lydia hosting dinner parties. In one, Arthur was described as her attentive partner and exceptional cook. The last mention was 2 months before her death. Margaret closed her laptop and looked at me, her expression grim. "You need to be careful, Helen." I nodded. "I know." What I didn't tell her was that careful wasn't going to be enough. I wasn't just going to survive this, I was going to end it. But to do that, I'd need more than suspicion, more than stories. I'd need proof that no one could ignore. And if Arthur thought he was the only one who could plan carefully, he was about to find out how wrong he was. The next morning, Arthur announced it like a decree. "No more takeout," he said, sliding a grocery list onto the counter as though I'd asked for one. "It's not good for you. I'll handle meals from now on." He didn't say it cruelly. He said it as if he were the benevolent king of a very small country. The kind of statement that could pass for care if you didn't listen too closely. "Okay," I murmured, because the best way to survive a storm is to lower your head and let the wind think it's winning. He smiled, satisfied, and started making coffee. He slid my mug toward me, a gentle nudge that carried the weight of a threat I pretended not to feel. I didn't drink it. I lifted the mug, inhaled the steam, and set it down when he turned to rinse a spoon. I'd already learned to move with him like a shadow, to be where he expected me to be, to swallow when he looked, to pause when his back turned. It was choreography now, a dance scored in whispers. By noon, he had commandeered the kitchen completely. He rearranged drawers I'd kept the same for 20 years. He labeled containers. He replaced our olive oil with a new bottle and tucked the old one behind the flour, then stood back and surveyed the room as though he were framing a photograph. "Looks better, doesn't it?" he asked. "It does," I said, because what else could I say? It looked like a crime scene that hadn't happened yet. He tossed me an apron anyway, an old one with fading strawberries. Wear it, he said, so you don't feel left out. I tied it on and smiled. When he turned to the stove, I used the pocket to slip my phone out and start a recording, just audio for now. The soft clink of jars, the quiet rattle of a cabinet, the chunky rhythm of a spoon circling a pot. It would be noise in a courtroom probably, but noise can tell a story. Lunch was a creamy potato leek soup poured into 2 bowls that he lined up like soldiers on the counter. He shaved pepper over mine with theatrical care. His hands were steady. His mouth looked almost pleased. "I'll bring the bread," he said. When he disappeared into the pantry, I moved fast. I scooped the top half-inch of soup into a thermos I'd tucked under the dish towel. By the time he came back with a basket of warm slices, my bowl was whole again, almost whole. Almost is all you need. We ate at the table by the window where I'd always sat to grade papers, to write shopping lists, to help our daughter if we'd had one. We didn't. Another almost. The soup was delicious. That familiar touch of bitterness came at the end, brushing the back of my tongue like a finger testing a pulse. "Good?" he asked. "Perfect," I lied, feeling the lie sit neatly beside the thermos in the dark. I excused myself halfway through the bowl and took my time in the bathroom running the tap so he would hear water and assume I was washing my hands. I watched my face in the mirror, calm, composed, 30 seconds older than the woman who had just swallowed the smallest sip of a plan. When I returned, Arthur had cleared our bowls and was wiping the counter with those broad, efficient strokes that used to make me love him for his tidiness. Now they made me wonder what else he'd wiped clean. "Rest," he said. "I'll handle the kitchen." I lay down on the couch and counted the beats of my heart until the nausea arrived. It came like thunder after a lightning flash, a low rolling pressure, then a wave that rose in my throat and stalled, only because I forced it to. My head pulsed. The ceiling light pooled into a bright coin that drifted. I breathed slowly, deeply, and imagined the thermos in the garage freezer. Proof, cooling down, proof, waiting. Arthur came to kneel beside me, a hand on my forearm, the good husband. "You don't look well." "I think I'll nap," I whispered. "I'll wake you for dinner," he said, and he tucked the throw blanket over me and spent too long smoothing it down as if tucking the edges of a shroud. The symptoms did not argue with certainty anymore. They arrived with the clock. 40 minutes after lunch they peaked. 90 minutes later I could move my head without the room shifting. I drank water in measured sips and wrote it all down in my notebook. Time, intensity, taste his movements, the dish, the color of the jar he touched before serving. The page looked like a scientist's ledger, or a killer's. By late afternoon I could stand again. I walked to the window and watched the maple leaves break light into pieces on the lawn. A neighbor jogged past with her dog, unaware that in the house across from hers, a woman was learning to pretend she was weaker than she was. Arthur hummed in the kitchen. It wasn't a tune I recognized. He only hummed when he was absorbed in something he liked. "Dinner at 7, he called. "Fine," I said. "I'll make the salad." "No, no," he answered, cheerful. "I've got it all." That told me 2 things: he needed full control of every plate, and he didn't want my fingerprints on the evening. So I took a shower instead. Steam and quiet. In the fogged rectangle of the glass, I wrote with my fingertip, "Don't eat." Then I wiped it away. I dressed in the soft gray sweater Arthur always complimented. I wanted him to look at me and see the wife he expected, even as I slid the tiny button camera into the notch between 2 cookbooks on the open shelf, even as I returned to the couch and tested the receiver in my pocket. The angle captured the prep area and the stovetop. Not everything, but enough. Almost. Arthur plated with ceremony. Lemon chicken piccata rice, pilaf green beans slicked with butter. A small glass of white wine for me only. He claimed wine gave him a headache. He set the glass down and hovered just a fraction too long, the way you do when you're laying a trap and want to see if the animal notices the string. "Looks beautiful," I said. My voice was steady. That steadiness felt like a new muscle. We said grace the way we do on holidays and never on ordinary nights, and then he raised his water and said, "To you, getting your strength back." To us, I replied, and let the rim of the wine glass touch my lips while my tongue stayed perfectly still. He ate 2 bites of green beans and pushed them around. He watched me more than his plate. When he looked down, I loaded my fork and lifted it and let the bite fall back with the softest tap, and then I dabbed my lips with the napkin, a magician's misdirection, the movement that tells the eye it saw what it did not. We talked about nothing. The weather, the bookstore, the neighbor's new mailbox. The wine smelled like summer. It tasted like a story that doesn't end well. When he got up to check the oven, I slid the plate's top layer into a plastic bag hidden in my lap. The button camera saw my hand and the edge of a napkin. It didn't see the fear tightening between my shoulder blades. But fear does not need to be visible to be true. I excused myself again midway through the meal, claiming a headache. He pressed a hand to my forehead with the concern of a sitcom husband. "You do feel warm." "I'll lie down," I said. He took my glass to the sink. He rinsed it. He watched the water swirl. When he turned off the tap, he looked at the drain a second longer than he needed to, a small grief for a dose that did not get to finish its work. In the bedroom, I knelt by the dresser and opened the bottom drawer where I kept old scarves and the velvet box with my mother's brooch. I pushed the scarves aside and lifted the false bottom Arthur didn't know about, a thin piece of plywood I'd added the year he started forgetting our anniversaries. Under it, the tiny lined envelopes I'd labeled in pencil, "Stew wed, soup free, wine sat," each sealed, each dated, each a piece of the story my body had been writing. I added the new baggie. "Wine tonight." My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against my knees until they quieted. The nausea came like a familiar guest right on time. I breathed through it. I watched the clock. I let the minutes teach me what I already knew. Sunday, I suggested church. We hadn't gone in months, but I wanted public space and witnesses and their simple safety. Arthur agreed instantly. Of course, he said too quickly. He liked being seen as the kind of man who agreed instantly to good things. After the service, in the churn of handshakes and coffee cups, I slipped into the side office where the church secretary had known me for 20 years. I closed the door and told her I needed a private health referral, a second opinion, and that I couldn't have the paperwork mailed to the house. I did not say the word poison. I did not need to. My eyes said it for me. She printed a list and folded it twice and pressed it into my palm, the way people pass notes in class. On Monday, I called the clinic from the bookstore's back room. I told them I wanted tests for heavy metals and for anything else a careful doctor could think to look for. "Discreetly, please," I added, and I heard my voice from a distance like a woman in a play, speaking lines, written for someone braver. They gave me a time, Tuesday 9:30. I said yes, and hung up, and stood there with my hand still on the receiver, feeling like a door had clicked shut behind me and locked from the inside. That night, Arthur made shepherd's pie, mashed potatoes piped like frosting, and I thought, this is what murder looks like when it wants to be loved. I smiled. I ate air. I saved proof. The camera blinked its small red eye. Later, when the headache came, I let myself cry for 3 minutes, exactly 3, and then I wiped my face, poured myself a glass of water, and practiced saying the words I would need soon. I have evidence. I have samples. I have recordings. I have dates and times and symptoms. I am not crazy. I am not guessing. I am not alone. The escalation was not only chemical, it was behavioral. With every meal he took off my hands, Arthur took something else: the grocery list, the spice choices, the decision to invite friends, the casual question of chicken or fish tonight that used to be my small daily freedom. He closed the windows earlier in the evening and said the drafts weren't good for me. He swapped my tea canister for a new one and said the brand I liked had changed suppliers. He laid vitamins by my water glass and tapped the table beside them as if reminding a child. "I know what's best," he said once. Lightly, a joke he let sit between us like a coin on a table. I left it there. I wasn't going to pay him with laughter. On Tuesday morning, I dressed in a navy cardigan and told him I was meeting Margaret for an early coffee. He kissed my temple and said, "Have fun." He held my gaze an extra beat, measuring something. Then he lifted his thermos and took a sip. I recognized it, the old olive oil bottle I'd moved behind the flower, and felt a jolt of something like triumph. He didn't know I could see. At the clinic, the nurse asked quiet questions and wrote in a blue pen. I handed over the first sealed envelope soup-free, and she looked at it the way a person looks at a photograph of a stranger who's about to be important. "We can run a panel," she said. "It'll take some time." I nodded. I didn't ask for a timeline. I wasn't going to live by a clock he could set. I was going to live by my own plan. When I left, I stood in the parking lot and let the sun warm my face until my shoulders dropped. Then I drove home, pulled into the garage, and slid the new labeled baggies into the freezer, each one a tile in the mosaic of what my husband had become. Inside, Arthur called from the kitchen, bright as a bell. "I'm marinating something special for tonight." "I can't wait," I called back. And I meant it. Not for the taste, but for the way the last piece of fear inside me hardened into strategy. Because I had what I needed now: my body's testimony, the camera's silent eye, the envelope's cold truth, the notebook's ugly ledger. And soon the clinic's numbers would arrive like a judge's gavel. Until then, I would eat air and swallow nothing and praise the chef like a grateful wife with a secret. And he would keep humming. And he would keep measuring. And he would keep forgetting that the kitchen did not make him powerful. It made me patient. The results from the clinic hadn't come yet, but my patience had become its own weapon. I'd been living in Arthur's carefully arranged kitchen for weeks now, and he still believed I was obedient, grateful, even dependent. That illusion was my shield, and I guarded it as fiercely as the evidence in my freezer. On Thursday, he brought home an expensive copper sauté pan. He set it on the counter like it was a trophy. "For you?" I asked, feigning surprise. "For us," he corrected, but his eyes said otherwise. "A gift. You'll see what I can do with it." The implication was clear: what I can do, not what you can do. Arthur had stopped pretending I had any place in the kitchen beyond sitting at the table like a child waiting to be served. That night, I decided to test just how much control he thought he had. When he served dinner, grilled salmon, lemon butter sauce, roasted asparagus, I took the plate, smiled, and walked to the counter to get a glass of water. But instead of returning immediately, I paused and looked into the sauté pan still resting on the stove. A faint white residue clung to the sides, as if something had been sprinkled into the sauce after cooking. Arthur's voice came from behind me. "Careful. Still hot." I turned glass in hand and gave him the most casual smile I could manage. "I know." The residue was already burned into my memory. After dinner, when Arthur went to the den to watch the news, I crept back into the kitchen with a small plastic spoon from the utensil drawer. I scraped the residue into a tiny baggie and slipped it into my sweater pocket. It would join the others in the freezer, the growing, silent army of proof. By now, I'd grown skilled at moving food without him noticing. I had developed a method: layer my plate so the portion he could see from his seat looked untouched, while beneath the top layer, I slid the poisoned food into a napkin-lined plastic container hidden in my lap. It required steady hands, a calm face, and a willingness to keep talking through the act. But it worked. Every night that passed without me ingesting more than a taste was another night my body got stronger while his certainty deepened. Friday afternoon, Margaret called with news. "I found something," she said, voice low. "A neighbor of Lydia's remembers her being sick for months. She said Lydia told her Arthur was taking care of her, cooking all her meals, making sure she didn't strain herself." Margaret paused. "The neighbor thought it was romantic. Until Lydia was gone." My skin prickled. And no one suspected anything, no, Margaret said. He's good at looking like a savior. I thanked her and hung up my pulse heavy in my ears. This wasn't just about me. This was a pattern, one he'd walked before, one he thought he could walk again. That evening, Arthur surprised me with wine red this time. He poured a generous glass and set it beside my plate without a word. I lifted it, swirled it, and inhaled. A faint chemical tang prickled at the back of my nose, masked by the deep fruitiness of the wine. Cheers, I said, raising the glass. He clinked his water against it, watching as I tipped the rim to my lips. I let the wine touch my mouth, then set it down, pretending to savor the taste while swallowing nothing. The next day, Saturday, I visited the clinic under the guise of going to the bookstore. I handed over the sauté pan residue and the wine sample. The nurse glanced at the labels and said, "You're thorough." "I have to be," I replied. She promised the lab would rush the tests. When I came home, Arthur was in the kitchen again, chopping herbs. He didn't look up when he said, "You're home early. Margaret had to cancel." I lied. His knife slowed for half a second before resuming its rhythm. I leaned against the doorway, studying the angle of his shoulders, the precision of his movements. Everything about him in that moment looked ordinary. That was the most dangerous thing about him, how ordinary he appeared while building a plan to erase me. That night, my symptoms were minimal. I'd eaten almost nothing, and the difference was undeniable. Arthur noticed too. "You seem better," he said, almost suspicious. "Rest helps," I replied. But it wasn't rest that was helping me. It was refusal. On Sunday, the clinic called. "We've found traces of a compound in the samples you provided," the doctor said. "It's consistent with low-dose exposure to thallium." Thallium. My breath caught. The metal that used to be in rat poison. Tasteless, odorless, lethal over time. "We'll run confirmatory tests," she continued, "but I suggest you avoid any food or drink from the suspected source." "I already am," I said, my voice steady. When I hung up, my reflection in the hall mirror startled me, the calm, cold focus in my own eyes. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was a countdown. That night, I set the table myself for the first time in weeks. Arthur came in, a little thrown. "What's this?" I thought I'd help, I said, laying down the last fork. "You do so much." He smiled, a little wary but pleased. "Maybe you are getting better." "Maybe," I said. Inside, I was already planning the next step, the moment he would be the one staring down at a plate, realizing too late what had been served. The moment the clinic confirmed thallium, something inside me clicked into place. I wasn't simply collecting evidence anymore. I was building the last chapter. But Arthur didn't need to know that. To him, I was still the grateful, recovering wife who marveled at his generosity in the kitchen. And I would play that role perfectly right up until the curtain dropped. On Monday morning, I started my final preparations. First, I reorganized the freezer. The labeled envelopes of saved samples were now in a small insulated bag I could grab in an instant. I placed them at the back, hidden behind the ice trays so Arthur wouldn't stumble upon them. Next, I printed copies of the photos I'd taken of his black notebook. The original images were already backed up to a cloud account under a name he'd never guess, but I wanted something tangible. Something I could hand to someone if I had to run. I slid the photos into a manila envelope and tucked it into my tote bag. Margaret was my emergency contact now. I'd told her enough for her to understand the danger, but not so much that she'd panic and do something rash. I gave her a copy of my house key and told her, "If you don't hear from me by Thursday morning, call the police, and bring this envelope to them." She didn't ask questions. She just hugged me and said, "I'll be here." Back at home, Arthur was unloading groceries. "Big week ahead," he said cheerfully. "I've got some special meals planned." I smiled and slipped off my coat. Looking forward to it. He didn't see the way my fingers tightened around the strap of my bag. That evening, I set the table again. Arthur glanced up from the stove. "You're really on your feet these days." "I told you I'm feeling better." I said, letting a soft laugh escape. Your cooking must be working. His grin was small but satisfied, the expression of a man who thinks his plan is working beautifully. Dinner was lamb stew with fresh bread. I let the steam warm my face as I ladled a portion into my bowl, making sure to scrape just enough into a sealed container hidden in my lap. When Arthur asked why I was eating so slowly, I said I just want to savor it. The next morning, I made my own grocery run while Arthur was at work. I bought 2 identical jars to the ones he kept in the spice rack, then filled one with powdered sugar, the other with cornstarch. They looked identical to his special jars. When I got home, I swapped my jars with his, leaving his real ones in a small cooler in the garage, sealed and labeled for the lab. I wanted him to think he still had control. I wanted him to keep cooking, keep dosing me right up until I made my move. By Wednesday, I had everything I needed: recorded footage of him sprinkling powder into meals, photographs of his notebook, multiple food and drink samples containing thallium, independent lab confirmation from the clinic. All that remained was to choose the moment. Thursday morning, over coffee, I told him I'd like to do something special for you this weekend. Let me cook for a change. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Feeling up to it, I am, I said, smiling. You've been so good to me, it's my turn. He hesitated, but his ego won. All right then. Surprise me. He had no idea the surprise would be his. For the next 2 days, I played the perfect wife. I tasted the dishes he made, or seemed to. I praised his seasoning. I asked for recipes. All the while, I kept up my quiet substitution, dumping his dosed food and replacing it with safe portions from my own stash. My strength returned, and with it, my calm. By Friday night, I was ready. Saturday morning, I went to the market early. I bought fresh vegetables, herbs, and a beautiful cut of steak. I also picked up something Arthur wouldn't expect: a small bitter herb I knew he disliked, but which in the right hands could disguise other flavors. When I got home, I set the ingredients on the counter and began preparing. The kitchen felt different that morning, warmer, lighter, as if it remembered who it belonged to. Arthur wandered in, curious. Smells good already. I smiled over my shoulder. You'll just have to wait and see. By noon, the table was set. 2 plates, 2 glasses of wine, soft light filtering through the curtains. I'd switched his wine glass with one I'd prepared earlier, the one that contained a measured dose from his own stash. Not enough to kill immediately, but enough to make him feel what I'd felt. Enough to make him understand. When he sat down, I lifted my glass. To us, I said. To us, he replied, and we drank. The steak was tender, the sauce rich. Arthur took several bites, smiling between chews. Then, about 20 minutes in, I saw it, the first flicker of discomfort in his eyes. The small swallow, the way his hand brushed the edge of the table. You don't look well, I said softly. He tried to smile. Just a bit lightheaded. Strange, I murmured, leaning forward. That's exactly how it started for me. His eyes locked on mine, and in that moment I knew he understood. I let the silence stretch between us until his hand began to tremble slightly against the tablecloth. You've been poisoning me, Arthur, I said, my voice calm even. And I have proof. Videos, samples, lab reports. Enough to bury you before dessert. His mouth opened, closed. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. You could have just left me, I continued. But you wanted control. You wanted the slow victory of watching me disappear. That's over now. I stood, gathering my plate. I'm not going to kill you, I said. I'm going to let you live with the knowledge that I beat you in your own kitchen. Then I walked out, leaving him at the table with the glass he'd drained and the slow realization that he wasn't the chef anymore. He was the served. Arthur didn't come after me when I left him at the table. I half expected him to follow, to bark denials, to try to wrestle the truth back under the rug where he'd kept it for weeks. But there was nothing. Just the muffled scrape of his chair and the faint clink of cutlery against china, as though he were trying to steady himself with the smallest, most ordinary sound in the world. I walked upstairs and into our bedroom, shutting the door with deliberate calm. From the dresser, I retrieved the insulated bag from the freezer and the manila envelope of photographs, setting them on the bed like a surgeon laying out instruments. It was time. I called Margaret first. "It's happening," I told her. Her breath caught. "Do you need me there?" "No," I said. "But be ready for the police to contact you. You'll have the backup copies." She didn't argue, just said, "Helen, end it." "I will." Next, I called Detective Sheila Morgan at the local precinct, the one I'd spoken to discreetly a week earlier, when I first suspected this would be my path. "I have everything I said. Samples lab confirmations, photographs, recordings, and an active incident from today." "You're safe?" she asked. "For now," I said. "But you need to come before he realizes just how much trouble he's in." She told me to stay upstairs to keep the evidence close and to expect officers within the hour. I agreed, hung up, and sat on the edge of the bed listening. Arthur's footsteps came and went across the hardwood below. Once I heard the faint rush of the tap running, then silence. The refrigerator door opened closed. Then a pause long enough to make my skin crawl, followed by the faint creak of the back door. I went to the window, careful not to make a shadow. He was outside, leaning on the porch railing, head bowed. From this angle, I could see the tremor in his right hand. The dose I'd given him wouldn't kill him. I'd been careful, but it was enough to mimic the early symptoms he'd forced on me: dizziness, slight nausea, that metallic taste in the mouth that sits like a secret you can't spit out. I didn't feel triumph. Not yet. I felt control. The same control he'd tried to strip from me returned with interest. The knock came 40 minutes later, firm, deliberate, unmistakable. Through the window, I saw Detective Morgan flanked by 2 uniformed officers. I opened the door before they could knock again. "Mrs. Cartwright," she said briskly, stepping inside. "Is he here in the kitchen?" I said. "I have everything upstairs." She nodded to one of the officers who moved toward the kitchen, the other following behind her. I led Morgan upstairs and laid the insulated bag and envelope on the bed. "Each sample is labeled with the date, the dish, and when symptoms appeared," I said. "The clinic has already confirmed thallium in at least 3 of them. The photos are of his notebook. He keeps records of what he feeds me and my reactions." Morgan's eyes were sharp, scanning each item with the detachment of someone who's seen too many variations of the same cruelty. "You've been very thorough," she said. "I had to be," I replied. From downstairs I heard Arthur's voice, low, uncertain, and the firmer, practiced tone of an officer responding. Then footsteps, heavier now, as they brought him into the living room. Morgan gestured for me to stay put, but I moved to the top of the stairs anyway. I wanted to see his face. Arthur was pale, beads of sweat on his temple, his jaw tight. When his eyes found me, there was no anger, just something closer to calculation. Even now he was looking for a way out. "They say you've accused me of something," he said, voice almost conversational. "I haven't accused you," I said evenly. "I've proved it." His gaze shifted to Morgan, then back to me. "You're making a mistake, Helen." "No," I said. The mistake was thinking I'd never see it. The officers didn't handcuff him immediately, not with him claiming dizziness, but they didn't leave his side either. One of them collected the black notebook from his study after I told them where to find it. Morgan handed me a form to sign, confirming the transfer of evidence from my possession to theirs. "You'll need to come in for a full statement," she said. "I understand," I replied. As they led Arthur toward the door, he glanced back at me. There was no plea, no apology. Just a thin, cold line of a mouth and eyes that promised he would keep calculating until the day someone else decided he'd calculated enough. At the station, I sat in a small interview room for nearly 2 hours, recounting everything from the first strange dinner to the moment I'd seen that residue in the sauté pan. I described the symptoms, the substitutions, the hidden camera, the freezer stash. I handed over the clinic's contact information and gave them permission to release all lab results. Morgan listened without interrupting, only jotting the occasional note. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "You've essentially built the case for us. It'll take time to process, but what you've done here, most victims never get the chance." I didn't tell her it wasn't chance. It was patience sharpened into a blade. By the time I returned home, the kitchen felt different. The hum of the refrigerator no longer sounded like a threat. The spice rack was still lined with jars, but the two I'd replaced the harmless ones were there in plain sight. I stood in the doorway for a long time, breathing in the absence of him. It was over. Not legally, not yet, but the danger was no longer in my house. And for the first time in weeks, I could imagine eating without wondering if the next bite would make me weaker. That night, I made myself dinner, nothing elaborate, just roasted chicken and vegetables. I ate at the table in silence, aware of every swallow, every sigh. Halfway through, I realized I wasn't thinking about the food at all. I was thinking about the moment he'd understood. The moment his face had gone still as stone, and he'd known I'd taken back everything he'd stolen. And I thought, that was the real meal. The rest was just garnish. Arthur was out of the house, but that didn't mean he was gone from my life. Not yet. The first night after his arrest, I slept with the bedroom door open for the first time in weeks. It wasn't that I expected him to come walking back through it. There were officers' paperwork and a cell between us now, but fear isn't logical. It lingers like the faint scent. 2 days later, the phone rang while I was folding laundry. The caller ID showed the county jail. I let it ring twice before answering. Helen. His voice was rougher than I remembered, maybe from the cold air and holding. I didn't say anything. They're saying things, ugly things. You told them lies. They're not lies, I said flatly. They're dates, doses, and proof. He chuckled, a sound that had always made me picture a man leaning back in his chair, amused by how little the rest of the world understood. You think you've won something, he asked. I have, I said. Time. Then I hung up. The story broke by the end of the week. It started as a small item in the local paper, man arrested in alleged poisoning case, but once the word thallium appeared in print, it spread. Neighbors started avoiding me in the grocery store aisles, not out of blame, but out of uncertainty, like they were afraid any wrong word might brush too close to something they didn't understand. Margaret came by often, her visits a steady hum of normalcy. We drank tea at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once sat watching Arthur hover over my plate. It's like the kitchen's yours again, she said one afternoon, glancing at the spice rack. It always was, I said quietly. He just forgot. The first letter arrived a week after his call. The return address was the jail. Inside, Arthur's handwriting curled across 3 pages, alternating between professing innocence, blaming my overactive imagination, and in chilling detail explaining how my health had improved under his care. I didn't finish reading. I slid the pages into a clear evidence sleeve and dropped them at the police station. Detective Morgan took them without comment, but I saw the tightness in her jaw. "Keep anything else he sends," she said. I nodded. I'm keeping everything now. Cooking for myself felt strange at first. I moved differently, slower, almost waiting for someone to step in and correct me. But no one did. The first meal I made was simple scrambled eggs and toast. I plated it and sat down at the table with a glass of orange juice. No hidden camera, no substitutions, no pretending to eat. And yet, when I lifted the first forkful, my hand trembled. I had to set it down, take a breath, and remind myself that the only ingredients here were the ones I'd chosen. It took a week before I could eat without checking the plate for anything unusual. Arthur wasn't idle in custody. Through his attorney, he started spinning a story that I was mentally unstable, that I had fabricated the evidence to cover up financial improprieties in our marriage. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so calculated. The man knew exactly which phrases made doubt bloom in the minds of strangers' unstable, vindictive money problems. But the evidence was too solid. The lab results had come back on all the samples, each confirming elevated levels of thallium. His notebook, his handwriting was damning. Still, I learned quickly that court isn't just about facts. It's about who can tell the cleaner story. Detective Morgan prepped me for the first hearing. "You don't need to be dramatic," she said. "Just be clear. You've got the receipts, let them speak." On the stand, I told the truth in the simplest way I could about the first meal, the aftertaste, the symptoms, the notebook, the jars, the freezer full of saved portions. When the defense tried to paint me as paranoid, I answered every question with the same steady tone. I didn't argue, didn't get angry. I just made them hear the timeline. When I stepped down, I saw Arthur watching me. His mouth was a thin line, his eyes sharp. But there was something else there too, a flicker of something like recognition. He knew I wasn't the same woman who'd smiled across the table while he salted my food. Court cases move slowly. Months passed. I filled the time with the small acts of taking my life back, repainting the kitchen, donating the dinnerware we'd bought together, replacing the spice rack with one I built myself from reclaimed wood. Margaret helped me plant herbs in the garden. Rosemary, basil, mint. Real flavor, she said with a smile. One evening, I made lamb stew my recipe my hands and ate it without once thinking of the taste as a weapon. That felt like its own verdict. The last letter came the day before the trial's closing arguments. It was short. "You think you've ended this? You've only ended the version of me you could see." I put it in the evidence sleeve with the others and didn't think about it again. Sometimes in the early hours of the morning, I'd walk into the kitchen and stand in the same spot I'd been in when I first noticed the aftertaste in my food. I'd close my eyes and remember the weight of the fork the way Arthur's eyes had stayed fixed on me. Then I'd open my eyes to see the room as it was now, mine safe, unshadowed. Survival wasn't just living past the danger. It was learning to sit at your own table again, without fear. The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the kind of scent that settles into the walls after decades of whispered negotiations and quiet verdicts. I'd been here so many times over the past months that the security guard at the entrance now greeted me by name. The trial was nearly over. All that remained were closing arguments, the final stories each side would tell before handing my life over to the jury. The prosecution went first. They didn't embellish. They didn't need to. They laid out the lab results showing repeated exposure to thallium, the dates matching my symptom logs, the photographs of Arthur's notebook, his handwriting recording each dish, each reaction. They showed still images from the hidden camera, Arthur's hand sprinkling a powder into my food before serving it to me. And then the prosecutor turned toward the jury and said, "This is not the story of a marriage gone bad. This is the story of a man who decided that control was worth more than life. And this is the story of a woman who decided to live." The defense, in contrast, painted me as overly suspicious, emotionally unstable, and motivated by financial gain. They claimed the notebook was a diet log, the powders natural supplements, and the lab results misinterpreted. Arthur sat there perfectly composed, wearing the suit he always saved for job interviews and weddings. When the defense attorney gestured toward me, he didn't look up, as if distancing himself from the very existence of the woman he had once tried to kill. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I spent the time in a hotel downtown rather than returning to the house. The kitchen was mine again, yes, but the thought of pacing those same floors while strangers decided whether the man who'd tried to erase me would walk free was unbearable. Margaret visited, bringing takeout and the kind of conversation that avoided the trial entirely. We talked about books, the weather, and her granddaughter's school play. But every time there was a knock or a phone buzzed, our voices stilled. When the call finally came, it was Detective Morgan's voice. "They're back. Can you be here in 30 minutes? I was there in 25. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with the collective breath of everyone waiting for the words that would end this chapter. The jurors filed in, their expressions unreadable. When the foreman stood, the silence felt alive. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant Arthur Cartwright guilty. The words were a clean cut through months of tension. My shoulders dropped before I even realized I'd been holding them so high. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't look at me. He just stared ahead, jaw tight. 2 weeks later, the sentencing hearing took place. The judge spoke of premeditation, of calculated cruelty, of breach of intimate trust. Arthur was given 30 years without the possibility of parole for 25. I had the right to make a victim impact statement. I'd written it the night before, scratching out and rewriting until the words fit the truth without spilling into the kind of anger that could be used against me. When I stood to read it, my voice was steady. You tried to make me doubt myself. You tried to make me smaller, weaker, quieter until I disappeared. But I didn't disappear. I learned your patterns. I learned patience. And I learned that survival can be deliberate. You used the kitchen as your weapon. I took it back. And I will keep it for the rest of my life. After the hearing, as officers prepared to take him away, Arthur finally looked at me. I never thought you'd figure it out, he said, almost conversationally. You underestimated the wrong person, I replied. For a heartbeat, there was something like a smirk on his face, not amusement exactly, but the faint acknowledgement of a worthy opponent. Then he turned and walked out, the chains at his wrists catching the light. The house was quiet when I returned that afternoon. The afternoon sun spilled across the kitchen floor, touching the cabinets, the spice rack, the table. I stood there for a long time, listening to nothing. No footsteps, no careful clink of glass, no voice asking good while my stomach twisted. I made tea, strong, fragrant, untouched by anyone's hands but mine, and sat at the table. The kitchen didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like mine. Entirely mine. The trial was over. Arthur was behind bars, the sentence carved into official record, the evidence locked away in police storage. On paper, I was free. But life after danger doesn't snap back into place like an elastic band. It moves slowly, awkwardly, like a limb learning to bear weight again. The first week after sentencing, I stayed close to home. Friends invited me out. Margaret suggested lunch at the cafe near the bookstore, others called to check in, but I found myself saying, maybe next week, more than I intended. It wasn't fear of running into Arthur that was impossible. Now it was the noise. Crowds. Conversations, the clatter of dishes in restaurants. All of it reminded me of the hum I'd trained myself to listen for in the kitchen, the tiny cues that something was wrong. Now that I didn't have to listen, my body still did. One morning, I stood in the kitchen and realized I was still moving around the room like a guest, not the owner. The spice rack Arthur had once dominated was still in its place. I hadn't replaced it after the trial, not because I wanted to keep it, but because touching it felt like picking up a weapon I no longer needed. That day, I emptied it completely. Every jar went into a box sealed and marked for disposal. In their place, I set the small wooden shelf I'd built during the trial, the one I'd sanded by hand on evenings I couldn't sleep. I filled it with herbs I'd dried myself, rosemary from the garden, basil from the pots. Margaret and I planted mint I'd hung to dry above the sink. The kitchen smelled different after that. Fresher. Honest. I forced myself to cook more often. At first it was simple things, omelets, soups, roast chicken. The act of tasting without suspicion was strange. I'd lift a spoon to my lips and, still for a heartbeat, wait for the bitterness that wasn't there. Some nights I'd sit down to eat and feel my stomach not out of habit the way it had when I'd pretended to eat Arthur's food. Then I'd take a breath, remind myself this is mine, and take the first bite anyway. Arthur tried writing again. The first letter came 2 weeks after sentencing. I didn't open it. I recognized the neat, deliberate handwriting and slid the envelope straight into the clear evidence folder Detective Morgan had told me to keep. By the time the third letter arrived, I'd stopped feeling anything at all when I saw his name in the return address. The power of his words had died the day he walked out of the courtroom in cuffs. One afternoon, Morgan stopped by to drop off copies of the official evidence inventory paperwork for the case file, now closed. We stood in the kitchen, the same room where she'd first seen the insulated bag of food samples months ago. "You did more than survive," she said, leaning against the counter. "You built the case that put him away." "That's rare." I shrugged, not out of modesty, but because I hadn't thought of it that way. I'd only done what I needed to do. Before she left, she glanced at the herb shelf. "Smells good in here," she said. "It's mine now," I replied. And I meant it. Freedom didn't mean the nightmares stopped. Some nights I'd wake to the phantom taste of metal on my tongue, my heart pounding as though I'd just swallowed something dangerous. When that happened, I'd go to the kitchen, make tea, and stand at the window until my breathing slowed. The moonlight on the herb pots was a quiet reminder. He's gone. The danger's gone. In early spring, Margaret invited me to a cooking class she'd signed up for at the community center. My first instinct was to decline. The idea of standing in a room full of strangers tasting dishes made by someone else's hands was almost too much. But Margaret pressed gently. "You can just watch," she said. "You don't even have to eat." So I went. It was awkward at first, my hands stiff on the cutting board, my shoulders tense when someone else stirred the pot. But by the end of the evening, I was laughing with the others, swapping tips, and even tasting the dish we'd made. It wasn't about the food. It was about proving to myself that the world outside my kitchen could still be safe. By summer, the routines of my life had shifted. The bookstore was still my anchor, but I'd begun taking on more hours, staying late to help with events. I hosted small dinners for friends, controlled familiar warm evenings where the only thing heavy in the air was conversation. And though I never said it aloud, I knew that part of me would always measure safety in tastes, smells, and the way a person watches you eat. That awareness wasn't a wound anymore. It was armor. By late summer, the house felt almost like mine again. The kitchen was brighter, the air lighter. But there was still one thing I hadn't done, one piece of fear I'd been circling without touching. I hadn't cooked his recipes. The dishes Arthur used to make the lamb stew, the clam chowder, the chicken and herb sauce were still written down in my mind like a list of closed doors. I avoided them without consciously deciding, to the same way you avoid an intersection where you once had a car accident. If I was ever going to close this chapter for good, I knew I had to open one of those doors myself. It was a Sunday morning when I decided. I woke to sunlight spilling across the bed and the faint scent of rosemary drifting in from the kitchen window box. The notebook in my mind flipped open, and there it was, the first dish he'd ever made for me. Chicken with herb sauce. That had been the opening move in his game, the meal that had seemed almost romantic at the time. I remembered the way he'd hovered, the way he'd smiled without quite reaching his eyes. I would take it back. I went to the farmer's market with a small list. Chicken breasts, fresh parsley, lemon, garlic cream. The same ingredients he'd used, but these would be mine. At one stall, a vendor handed me a bunch of parsley and I inhaled its clean, sharp scent. It no longer carried the echo of danger it once had. It was just parsley. When I got home, I laid everything out on the counter. The sunlight pooled across the wood, catching on the silver edge of the knife. I worked slowly, deliberately, slicing the chicken into even pieces, crushing the garlic beneath the flat of the blade, watching the cream swirl into the pan until it thickened. Every step felt like an untying, as if I were undoing a knot I'd lived with for too long. I didn't think about his hands stirring, his voice instructing, or the way he used to time my first bite. I thought about the sound of the sauce bubbling, the scent of lemon zest in the air, the weight of the spoon in my hand. When the dish was done, I plated it the way I would for a friend, a little parsley scattered over the top, the sauce spooned just so. I sat at the table with the plate in front of me, steam rising. For a moment, the air thickened with memory. I could almost see him across from me, eyes fixed on my fork. Then I blinked, and the chair was empty. I lifted the first bite to my mouth, tasted the bright lemon against the richness of the cream, the tender chicken beneath. No bitterness, no metallic tang, just food. Margaret arrived an hour later as planned. I'd called her that morning and told her I was cooking something special. She took one bite and smiled. "This is wonderful, Helen. It's the first thing he ever made for me," I said. "And the last thing I ever let him own." We ate in the sunlight with the windows open and the herbs from the garden scenting the air. That night, after the dishes were washed and the house was quiet, I stood in the kitchen with the empty plate in the sink. The dish had been good, not just edible, but mine. Completely mine. And with that, I felt something loosen in my chest. Arthur could keep his version of the story whatever shape he tried to give it in his mind. I had mine. And mine ended with me cooking his recipe and tasting only peace. It had been 3 months since I'd cooked the chicken with herb sauce. 3 months since I'd taken back the one recipe that had once marked the beginning of Arthur's quiet war against me. Life had fallen into a rhythm I could trust again. Mornings at the bookstore. Afternoons in the garden, evenings in a kitchen that no longer felt like enemy territory. But peace, I've learned, is never immune to intrusion. It arrived on a Tuesday in the same dull cream envelope as the others, with his name in the return address. Most of his letters I'd slipped into a plastic evidence sleeve without reading, but this one was heavier, a small bulge pressed against the paper. I stood at the kitchen counter holding it between my fingers, debating. I could hand it straight to Detective Morgan. I could drop it into the shredder without ever seeing its contents. Instead, I slid it open carefully like diffusing a trap. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a recipe card. It was written in Arthur's precise, deliberate handwriting. Lamb stew, the same dish he'd made for me the week before my symptoms had first turned severe. Under the ingredient list in smaller writing he'd added, "For when you remember what we had." It was almost laughable, the arrogance of sending me the blueprint for one of his poisons dressed up as nostalgia. But beneath the smugness was something else. Something I recognized instantly. Control. Even from behind bars, he was trying to reach into my kitchen. My fingers tightened around the card. For a moment, I imagined burning it right there on the stove, watching the ink curl and blacken until nothing remained. But then another thought came, quieter, sharper. You already took back the chicken. Why not the lamb? If the chicken had been the start of his game, the lamb had been the height of it, the dish that had nearly sent me to the hospital. If I could cook it myself, eat it without fear, I could strip that memory of its teeth for good. I called Margaret that afternoon. "I need you to come over for dinner tomorrow," I told her. "What's the occasion?" "I'm cooking something I swore I'd never make again," I said. "And I'd rather not do it alone." She didn't hesitate. "I'll bring wine." The next day, I laid the recipe card on the counter. I followed the list exactly, not because I trusted his version, but because I wanted to overwrite it with my own. Lamb, onions, carrots, potatoes, rosemary, thyme. Stock rich enough to coat the back of a spoon. As the stew simmered, the kitchen filled with the same scent I remembered from that night years ago, but this time there was no undercurrent of unease, no weight in the air. It was just dinner. Margaret arrived just as I was ladling the stew into bowls. She took one bite and let out a satisfied sigh. "Helen, this is amazing." I smiled. "It's his recipe." Or it was. She looked up, eyes sharp with understanding. "Not anymore." We ate until the bowls were empty, laughing over small stories, the kind of conversation that makes time pass without notice. After Margaret left, I washed the dishes and dried my hands. Then I picked up the recipe card, the one Arthur had sent like a ghost slipping through the bars. I lit a match and held the corner of the card to the flame. The fire caught quickly, curling the paper into black ash that floated down into the sink. When it was gone, I rinsed the ash away, watching it swirl down the drain. He could keep his games, his manipulations, his endless need to reach into my life. The lamb, like the chicken, was mine now, I used to think survival was about getting through the worst moments, the night you feel your heart beating too fast, the morning you wake up wondering if you'll make it to the next. Now I know survival is quieter than that. It's about reclaiming the moments you didn't think you'd ever get back. 3 weeks after burning the lamb stew recipe, I received one final letter from Arthur. No recipe card this time, just a single page with 2 sentences. You may have taken my kitchen away, but you'll never stop tasting me in your food. I read it once, felt the old weight press briefly against my ribs, then folded it and slid it into the evidence sleeve with the others. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was proof that even now he couldn't stand the idea that I had won. That afternoon, I drove to the police station and handed the sleeve to Detective Morgan. "This is the last one," I said. She took it, her eyes steady on mine. "Then we're done here." "Not just here," I replied. "Everywhere." That night, I stood in my kitchen, lit only by the small lamp over the sink. The herb shelf cast soft shadows across the counter. The wooden spoons rested in their jar, the spice rack held nothing I hadn't chosen myself. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Arthur at all. I was thinking about the meals I wanted to make next week: a peach tart for Margaret, a pot of soup for the neighbor who'd just had surgery, something simple for myself. The kitchen wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a place for beginnings again. Arthur had taught me the danger of trust without awareness, but the months I'd spent turning his own precision against him had taught me something greater: that patience can be more powerful than anger, and that taking back your life isn't just about surviving what someone does to you. It's about refusing to let them decide what comes next. I had taken his recipes, his patterns, and his control, and I'd rewritten them. Every dish I cooked now was a reminder I'm still here. I'm the one serving. If you've been where I've been, in a situation where someone is trying to make you smaller, weaker, easier to erase, I want you to hear this. You can take it back. It doesn't have to be fast. It doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be yours. As I write this, there's bread cooling on the counter. The smell fills the air, warm and clean. It will be sliced and shared with people who are safe to feed, people whose eyes will meet mine across the table without any shadow in them. And if you're listening to this somewhere wondering if you can ever sit at your own table again without fear, trust me, you can. It might take time. It might take patience. It might take every ounce of quiet strength you have. But one day you'll lift your fork, take a bite, and taste nothing but peace. If you've lived through something like this, I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments, or just know you're not alone. And if you want more stories about survival, betrayal, and taking back control, subscribe to Grace's Truth, where every story ends with the person who fought back.